As Mike said, we've broken the presentation into a couple of different components. And I'm going to just kind of quickly run through some ideas and concepts and see if they resonate with all of you. And if you have questions along the way, we can certainly make this interactive. I think, as everyone knows, the pandemic has been incredibly challenging from many different fronts. A lot of companies who were resistant, as Mike said, to the cloud have all of a sudden found their way moving to the cloud or desperate to get there. And certainly there have been a lot of implications to that from a cybersecurity standpoint. And I would say that, the complexity around risk and cyber has continued to escalate over the years. It certainly was true before the pandemic, with disruptive technologies, IoT-based devices and machine learning and cloud advancements. All of those sort of things were combining to really change the risk landscape. We've certainly seen our share of geopolitical events across the globe. Certainly the elections have escalated risk and cyber. You can't pick up any newspaper. Well, nobody picks them up. They read them on their phones. But you can certainly read about all of the craziness that's going on in the world. There's a great book by Teresa Payton called Manipulated that she wrote about the 2016 elections, which came out a couple of weeks ago. Read that before the election and you'll find how many people have been swayed by real fake news, which sounds kind of crazy, real fake news. And then, of course, the UK's exit from the European Union has created complexities that are starting to show up now in the world. And then in the middle of all that, the COVID-19 crisis. And so risk and risk culture has been under pressure at enterprises and companies around the globe. And nothing could be more true than today. And I'll give you some statistics to kind of highlight that for you. Since the pandemic arrived, here in the US, nearly 50% of workers are now working from home. And in some industries and some companies that I'm working with, it's closer to 90%. In my prior role, clearly you've got, they're a distribution company with 30 different distribution centers around the US. Those distribution centers, can't operate without people in them. So they've had to take precautions, just like manufacturers here. Mike and I both know a number of different manufacturing organizations, and they've had to take, unique precautions to keep employees safe, et cetera. So massive movement to work from home. I used to have a boss that would walk the aisles on Fridays around 4 to see who was around. Those sorts of things don't happen anymore. Maybe they're scrolling virtually to see whose little green ball is green or red or yellow or away. But definitely a major influence on cyber. This was a report from the FBI. They said that they saw an increase of 800% cyber crimes reported since the pandemic arrived. This is a midsummer stat. I think it's closer to 1,000% now. And with the elections upon us, I think that number is going to climb even more. The same thing is true of banks. They're saying 230% increase in cyber reported crimes. Phenomenal numbers when you step back and think about it. And businesses, when they were surveyed by the Wall Street Journal, more than half expected that they'd have a breach or a cyber incident related to some sort of remote working experience. So massive numbers. And this last statistic here came from the same research paper, but cybersecurity professionals say only 41% of the time, meaning almost 60% of the time, they don't feel they've got the best platforms to secure remote workers. So those are some of the headlines around, kind of what we're dealing with from a risk and cybersecurity standpoint. And interestingly enough, people who are newly working from home, 53% are using their own computers to do work, or their own cell phone. So that's a pretty big number. And almost 45-50% are saying that they're not being provided any new insights or training. So that's become a real challenge as people are working from home. If you have a spouse and you have kids, everyone's online, everyone's pulling bandwidth. My prior company manufactures home entertainment equipment, including routers, switches, access points, outdoor TVs, things of that nature. interestingly enough, their business is up 20% over last year. That's pre-COVID numbers. So people are home, they're working, is putting a lot of pressure on home networks. Cybersecurity training is becoming more prevalent now. I've seen some companies actually take their corporate cybersecurity training and make it available to families as well. So that's an interesting statistic. They actually interviewed and surveyed people who work with PII, that's personally identifiable information. And surprisingly, a bunch of them are using their own personal computers instead of corporate sponsored computers. Many of them are posting pictures of their work environment from home while they're working with PII, kind of crazy. And many of them, you see 37% are reusing passwords for business applications and personal accounts as well. And over 50% say that their companies have not provided any new policies or training around PII. So just some staggering numbers to think about as we're dealing with the pandemic. What I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit and talk about 8 major trends that I think are influencing risk and cybersecurity in organizations. And we'll talk about digital transformation in a moment. But the first of which is a brand new Department of Defense standard called Cybersecurity Maturity Certification. It's a new process that launched in January. They started working on this over a year ago, and programs are now starting to, or RFPs are starting to show up where companies are beginning to adopt this new standard. And I'm going to talk more about what that standard looks like and give you some specifics on why you should pay attention to it. It's made some huge improvements over the traditional NIST framework that many of us are familiar with. So that's a new standard, and what we're seeing is many companies are starting to adopt the CMMC philosophies and standards and practices because it shores up some gaps in the NIST framework. So that's one major trend. A second major trend centers around, not surprisingly, machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we're starting to see some incredibly sophisticated solutions show up that are now available to cybersecurity professionals. Things like cybersecurity report cards like BitSight. I happened to be a customer of BitSight when I was at Snap AV. Phenomenal platform, and really was instrumental in helping us get our arms around our public IP, and it also helped us with board reporting in a way that I wasn't able to do prior to getting the tool. And I've got a snapshot of what that looks like here coming up. But you're also seeing machine learning and artificial intelligence used for things like email protection and endpoint protection. It's very sophisticated tools like CrowdStrike and Mimecast and many others. So pretty fascinating to see the evolution of market-ready solutions that are being built around machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think that market's going to mature, and as cybersecurity professionals, we're going to be able to benefit from that in our companies. And these tools give you the option or the ability to actually deploy state-of-the-art, next-gen solutions without adding a ton of staff. In fact, no staff in most cases. So pretty interesting evolution. Contactless. I've been working and consulting in a number of companies since I retired. That word retired does not really ring true for me because I've actually had a whole lot of fun and working with 6 or 7 clients that I'm consulting with across the US. But contactless transactions are really being introduced, and that could potentially bring new threats and vulnerabilities to the table. A lot of companies are thinking about putting contact tracing apps on their phones so they can keep track of whether or not an employee is in a building or not, or even tracking their medical status. I've heard some companies talk about tracking people's temperatures. Obviously, you get into privacy issues and cloud security issues, so that's another trend that I think we're seeing. A lot of countries around the globe have been requiring citizens to actually install contact tracing apps on their phones. But interestingly enough, including in communist countries, they're not really getting huge adoption rates, which is interesting. Hybrid work. This has really been an interesting challenge, and I've watched this firsthand in some companies that I'm consulting with. But when you've got people working in the office now at home all of our models prior to COVID-19, the behavioral models were really geared at sort of in-office activities with a small percent of work from home. So anomalous behavior, trying to understand who's a real user versus who's a compromised user is a lot harder to deal with these days because of the nature of the work that we're doing. So these hybrid work models are really putting some pressure on cybersecurity professionals to understand who's legitimately on the network that should be there and who's not. I think also IoT, huge proliferation of IoT devices across the globe, both in homes and at work. Lots of sensors being deployed with software in them. I have a ton of experience in this space coming from my prior life, built a cloud-based, IoT-based platform. And several years ago, I made a big push at that organization because we were putting onboard firmware with software embedded in them that I was concerned about. So we actually launched an initiative where we hired a third party. We used Fortalice Solutions here, a Charlotte-based company with a ton of experts that are, NSA, CIA, FBI, technology experts that are. We gave them our top 10 products and asked them to have their way with the platforms. Not all IoT manufacturers are doing those sorts of rigorous tests, but when you put these items on your network, you've got to pay attention to them and make sure that their risk profiles are understood. So we're going to see more and more of that exploding over the months and years to come. Privacy is a huge concern. I'm starting to see chief privacy officers pop up in companies, especially larger enterprise companies, where you might have seen that nestled into the chief risk officer's responsibility, but privacy is becoming a big concern. It started in 2018 with GDPR, and then California launched their, California Consumer Privacy Act, which became effective this January. And we're going to start to see a lot more of those state-sponsored privacy laws come into play. So I think you'll see privacy officers pop up. And that's going to put more pressure on the cybersecurity teams to understand and know what their risks and concerns are and how policies should be shaped. One company that I consult with, that's the first words out of their mouth is, have you considered the privacy aspects of this solution? So it's interesting to see the evolution of that space as time marches on. Cloud, we've been talking about cloud in IT forever, but the adoption rates certainly accelerated during COVID. Last year, Gartner came out with their Secure Access Service Edge technology framework that I see a number of companies adopting, and it's putting interesting challenges and opportunities in front of cybersecurity professionals to move cybersecurity and firewalls and those sorts of things to the cloud. So we'll see lots more activity around that area as well. And then zero trust is something that, in my past, prior to the last 6 months in particular, that seemed more like a buzzword than a reality. But we're starting to see this happen. And I think a lot of companies, especially because of COVID-19, were really sensitized to their VPN infrastructure. And so we're starting to see companies adopt zero trust networks, and we'll see the traditional VPNs going away and zero trust network platforms take their place. So those are the big major trends. There's some key insights that I take away when I look at the landscape. I think there's three big things from a technology and cybersecurity standpoint that I think about. The first of which is learning. And when you have automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning, as it evolves, the key for us will be to figure out which alerts are legitimate and which ones are not. How do you figure out where the noise is and where the real issues are? That's a learning that I think we're going to have to accelerate. Some of these new solutions that I've talked about, BitSight in particular, CrowdStrike, a platform that I used in my past, are all getting much, much better at not giving you false positives. But I think that's a big area that I think as we mature in our cybersecurity landscape, that we're going to have to continue to get much better at. I think back to the Target incident, probably 2013, 2014, and their big issue was they actually were alerted, but it got buried in a sea of alerts. This third party that compromised their their network through an HVAC vendor somewhere in Pennsylvania, I think. But this is a key area. It's something we'll have to continue to pay attention to. And I think the other key insight is that at the end of the day, no matter what tools you have, people are going to be your first line of defense. So teaching people cybersecurity awareness and teaching them what safe links are and doing your cybersecurity awareness training is going to continue to be the best way for you to make sure that people don't contribute to the problem. And I think the other big key insight that I've learned, and I've been a cloud first sort of CIO for a long time, and now I'm partner first CIO, and I think about who can I bring into my ecosystem to help me manage these complex changes that we're all facing. And so cybersecurity, I say here, it's become a team sport. And by that, I mean, it's not something that I'd recommend anyone go alone. There's too many skill sets that are needed. You couldn't hire enough people to kind of match the progress that cyber criminals are making in the marketplace. So it's not a good idea to go it alone. And I think finding partners like BitSight and others is really kind of core to your strategy.